and welcome to episode 187 of the Clean Energy Show. I'm Brian Stockton.
I'm James Whittingham. This week, small modular nuclear reactors are in trouble for reasons I've been saying on this show. Why do people only listen for my sexy voice and not my clean energy insights, Brian?
I thought they listened to help fall asleep. Switzerland has announced plans to drop tax incentives for EVs. First, Switzerland has incentives, then they drop them? I thought they were supposed to be neutral.
There's about 12 years to decarbonize electricity, so I take a look back 12 years to see how far we've come. I've gained a lot of weight, I know that. And we all know calories are a unit of energy, so it's a pretty messy story.
The cruise robotaxi company is in trouble after it was discovered their algorithm may have difficulty detecting children. Said a spokesperson for Cruise, you want us to not run over children. Okay, we weren't clear on that.
All that and more in this edition of the Clean Energy Show. And also this week, Kim Kardashian introduces a new bra with built-in nipples. Why, you ask? Because climate change. More on heat pumps in cold climates, the benefits of overbuilding wind, solar, and batteries, and more.
Yes, and more construction here at my house. So again, if you hear noise, was it bad last week? I haven't listened to the show.
Oh, it's a good show. It was one of our best shows, Brian. Jesus, I can't believe you didn't hear that one.
Yes.
At least you paid attention while we were doing it, right? I mean, you were conscious and participating and everything, right?
Well,
you weren't drunk.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's just say yes. But anyway, some closet organizers going in today, so there may be some more construction sounds.
This is a running joke on the show now. It's a running joke. That's what it is.
Anyway, I want to talk quickly about CBC Radio. Our local CBC radio station had a discussion this past week on their show Blue Sky, and they asked me to be a guest briefly because I'm a co-host of the Clean Energy Show and because I have a heat pump. So they had a whole hour-long discussion about heat pumps. But first of all, I want to say congratulations to Garth Materi, the host of the show. James, he's been hosting that show for 150 years. Did you know that?
150 years. Wow. He's only slowed down just a bit.
Yeah, and he's retiring. So that was his last regular show, apparently. And it was nice to be on that. But that's got to be the hardest job in broadcasting because it's one of those shows where they take calls sometimes from regular people. And that's the job in broadcasting I would least want to have.
And we all know how regular people are very, very ornery and basically full of hate.
And you never know when someone's going to, call up and, just say, "You suck, Garth," or something, and before they get hung up on. But which reminds me of the days when I used to work in radio. So I used to work at CKCK Radio, an AM station here in Saskatchewan. I started when I was 17 years old. So this is ancient times. This is like the early 1980s. And that station had call-in shows, like a couple hours a day were call-in shows. And it just got me to thinking about that and the 7-second delay. So back in the early 80s, I don't know what they do now or even if they bother to do this, but our station had a 7-second delay so that you could dump out a call. Like if somebody starts cursing or something on the air, obscenities, you could press a button and then you would sort of dump the 7-second delay and you could hopefully then get rid of the caller and the obscenities wouldn't go on the air. But I don't know, it just occurred to me, I hadn't thought about that in ages, and it must have been really advanced technology for the time. Like there was this machine, we had a box, and you had to press the button to build up the delay, right? Like it would take a while, like 20 minutes or something, to build up slowly the 7-second delay. Yeah. So I guess this was like an early sampling device or something. I don't know, but you would have to press the button. It would take like 20 minutes to build up to that 7-second delay. And then if you had to use it, you would press the button so that 7 seconds would go away. They get rid of the caller. But then you didn't have the delay anymore after that. So you'd have to press the button again and work up the delay. So, I don't know if they even bothered to do that kind of thing anymore.
I think they do, especially in the United States, where you can get fined for obscenities.
Yes.
Like Booker.
And I think that's why they had this machine in place. They were worried about getting fined. I think that's a possibility here. But anyway, that off topic. But I'd just been thinking a lot about that. So they had a whole hour-long discussion about heat pumps, and a lot of it was really focused on how they work. And, you and I have talked a lot about just like the branding of heat pumps, the name of heat pumps, like just, it's not a particularly great name. Like to call something a heat pump, it doesn't really explain what it does. And I think that partly explains the urge to have to keep explaining them over and over again. So anytime there's a news story about heat pumps, they have to explain the technology. So that's what a lot of this hour-long discussion, and I was only on it for about 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, and Brian, I can tell you, Garth, the host, had no idea at the end of the show what a heat pump was completely baffled and frustrated that no one would explain it to him.
Okay, but here's the revelation I had after the show was over. Of course, I didn't think of this while I was on the air, but after the show was over, I had this revelation. It's like, wait a minute, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how they work. How they work is not important. And I think the only reason people are obsessed with how they work is just because it's new and they don't understand it. It's called a heat pump.
Well, what they can't get under their craw, Brian, is that it takes heat out of minus 25 degree Celsius temperatures and puts it into your house. Like, you know, that's a bit mind-blowing, but it involves physics. And if you're not into physics, and really, I'm not.
Yeah,
I dabble in it.
I think we should stop trying to explain what they are, and you know, it's really just it's a naming problem. So, not like we're going to be able to influence what they're called, but really, they should be called high efficiency electric heating and cooling.
Heat transfer
that
machines
should be the name of it. Or maybe a heat transfer machine. But the important thing is that it can heat and cool your home with electricity, and it does it with super high efficiency. Because everybody knows you can heat your home with electricity, but we don't do it because it's not efficient enough, and you have to use a lot of power, and it ends up being quite expensive. So if you just say this is high efficiency electric heating, and it uses 1/3, 1/4 the power of normal electric heating, that's all you need to know. You don't need to know how it works.
A fridge, how does it work?
Yeah.
It takes heat out of the fridge
I had no idea.
and dumps it into your house. And, you know, it's hot by your fridge. How does that work?
Yeah.
Well, we accept it. It just does.
Yeah.
It's through compression and decompression of a fluid, of a refrigerant, and that's how it works.
And of course, air conditioners work the same way, but I was thinking about even that, like the name air conditioner is not a particularly good name either. Like really what it does is cool the air. It should be called an air cooler, but they've been around so long and we've been calling them air conditioners so long that everybody by now understands what they do. So the name air conditioner doesn't seem to be a problem at the moment. But yeah, this heat pump should just be called high efficiency electric heating and cooling.
If I was Garth Materi, host of a radio show that spans an entire Canadian province, I would maybe look at a YouTube video on how a heat pump works before I did the show. His second show of the week. But then again, the guy's retiring, and really, if you were retiring, did you really care? I'm sure you did, actually. In your last class you taught, I'm sure you didn't just come naked and say, do whatever you want. You gave it until the end.
No, I read a book in the corner and, you know, told them to do whatever they want.
My son texted me this morning, first thing, and said that in his city where he's living now, they have Chevy Bolt EVs doing parking enforcement, which is hated by every university student. I can tell you that I did. But yeah, what a progressive city. Chevy Bolt electric vehicles doing the parking enforcement, fairly compact vehicle.
I don't know if you remember, but back when we were kids, our city had little 3-wheel cars that did the parking enforcement.
Those
Do you remember
were weird.
those?
I think some cities still have those. Not too many, but they're... Yeah. I never understood how they worked at minus 40 degrees.
Yeah, it's just, I just always remember those weird little 3-wheel vehicles. But yeah, that would have been tough as a parking enforcement guy. Probably not a lot of heat in the cabin there.
And speaking of weird things, I want to introduce a word that I may have mentioned on the show before, and that is Dunkelflaut. That is a German word, which means the time of year where the wind and solar doesn't provide much in a region. So you build your clean energy system for the Dunkelflaut, not Duncan, Dunkelflaut time. So that's part of what energy modeling people do.
Those Germans have a word for everything.
They do, Brian, they do. I was driving home from the gym last week. We had a fresh snowfall of snow, and it was slushy, which is weird for here because it's warm. And I hit the brakes, and all the snow from my roof covered my front window, my front windshield completely. And I was at a stoplight braking and completely blind. And I wasn't sure if my windshield wipers would get it off because it was like 3 inches thick, or, you know, it was pretty thick. And it did. Fortunately, I would have had to get out. But that's never happened to me before. And I blame climate change because, you know, that's something for Chicago, New York, Toronto. These things don't happen here where you have wet snow. It's always dry and powdery because it's so bloody cold and dry.
I mean, you are supposed to clear the snow off the roof when you're driving, before you start driving. So I would say it's technically your fault, but that's never happened to me either.
Yeah, well, I usually I don't care, and I have a windshield wiper on the back of all of our cars. So if it does happen to go backwards, which is where it usually goes, then it's And sticking with my son, he lives with his great uncle, who is an intelligent and personable guy. However, he has he's the same age as about Ringo Starr, I would say. Very old, from that generation. Not, what is that, the silent generation? You're a generational expert.
Yes, that sounds right.
83 years old.
How many hit singles did he have?
None. My son doesn't want to argue because he's the hand that feeds him, literally. He lives there for free.
Sure.
And his uncle doesn't want to charge him anything for food or rent or anything. But he has to abide by his uncle's rules and not argue with him too much. Because he has his opinions. And his opinion is that Canada only has 2% of global emissions or something like that.
Yeah. And that's a stat we sometimes hear from the pro oil and gas people. It's like, oh, Canada, we're a tiny country. We've only got 40 million people. Look at China. They got 1 billion people. They're making all the pollution. That's the argument.
I don't know how people will argue with me how this reminds them of anything, but when I was a kid, the first joke I ever tried to retell, and I don't remember it exactly, but it had to do with a parachutist whose parachute didn't open. So he's radioing to the ground. He says, my parachute isn't opening. What should I do? And it's like 10,000 feet. He says, okay, how high are you? 10,000 feet? Oh, you got lots of room. Okay, well, try wiggling around. And then he radios back, says it doesn't work. He says, well, what altitude are you? I'm at 2,000 feet. Okay, well, wiggle around some more and see if it opens. And he says, that doesn't open. So he says, what elevation are you now? And he says, 10 feet. And he says, oh, you can jump from there. I don't know how that applies, but it somehow reminds me of that. Mathematical argument. I was like 5 when I told that joke. And you know what, Brian? I've never been a joke teller. I don't retell jokes. So it's one of the few jokes I've ever told in my life because I'm not good at that. The thing that I've read on Twitter from climate activists is to say that all countries who have Canada's emissions are less than 2 or 3%. They add up to 36% of all the carbon in the world, carbon emissions in the world. So if we don't address more than a third of the carbon, we're screwed. Like everybody has to pull up and do their part. Even Canada, it's not insignificant. Every ton counts. And I don't know how you explain it to people like that, but boy, there's a lot of people like that around here.
Well, it's a really good point because, you know, as you and I go out into the world, we might, you know, start talking to people and say some, you know, optimistic things about, you know, how we can get off of fossil fuels. And that's exactly the kind of point that somebody is likely to bring up. It's like, well, Canada, we only make 2% of the emissions. Come on, it's no big deal.
It's like saying I only murder 2% of the people. Well, why have police officers?
But I wouldn't, unless we had discussed this today on the show, I wouldn't have had a retort for that. And now I have a retort for that. And it's like, well, guess what? A third of all the world's emissions come from those smaller emitting countries, those 2%. It's 36% comes from those smaller emitters.
And then they say, well, China's not doing anything. Well, holy crap, are they? And we'll talk more about that later in the show. So there's this EV rewards thing that's going on with our power utility that I signed up for both my EVs for. I've got a 2013 Nissan Leaf. It's very old. It was a base model. And I got a device sent to me by FedEx for it that plugs into the computer port. And then it sends data by cellular network. Well, it turns out I told them what car I had, and they said later, well, we don't know, that doesn't work with our system. So I've got this, I don't know how much this device costs, and it's completely useless to me, but I'm sure it was a couple $100 because it's a specialized device that has a cellular connection. And then they sent one for my wife's car, the Chevrolet Bolt, which is brand new, 23 model. And now they're saying it doesn't work. In a month, it'll work.
Oh.
And the whole point of this is to test EV drivers to see if they will charge at night when the grid is low demand. We'll pay you money to do that. So will that incentivize you to do that, and we'll monitor how you're charging? So we're not going to get our money back until they figure this computer thing out. And it's just I think it's an American company that is selling its services to various utilities, and it's just a crap show, and it's very disappointing. And I want my money, Brian. I want my money. It would have worked with the Nissan Leaf if it had its own telematics, but the Nissan Leafs from that era, I think it was like the level 3 cellular network that's obsolete now and been shut down. So even if you did have it wouldn't work anymore.
Yeah, maybe even the level 2. I forget what they're called, though. Yeah.
So that's that. And I hope, one day they're going to incentivize you to charge in the daytime because it's going to be sunny and there's going to be lots of solar around, and it won't be at night. At night's going to be when we have the least renewables. So that's actually going to flip one day. That means that if people are still driving to a workplace, that they need to be able to charge at work in the future, and not that far in the future, 10, 15 years, I would imagine. So yeah, something to think about.
Yeah. All right. So Switzerland has pulled the plug on their tax breaks for electric vehicles, but I would call this kind of a good news, bad news story. The bad news is that they're getting rid of this EV incentive, but the good news is they're doing it because they say that they've reached a penetration now of electric vehicles in Switzerland where this is no longer necessary. They've had this in place since, can you believe it, 1997.
Wow.
They put in this tax exemption.
How many electric vehicles were even available back then in Europe? I mean, there must have been a couple, but wow.
Obviously not very many, but and now this year, EVs are set to be 23% of all car imports. This story from Electrek, by the way. Now that EVs at 23%, they figure, okay, well, it's time to start getting some tax revenue because, of course, you lose, it's a tax incentive. It's a tax reduction. So now that they're putting this back into place, it's going to start again on January 1st, 2024. They're going to make about $2.2 billion a year on this tax break that they had been giving it. So
that's a lot of money.
Yeah. We've talked about this a lot, that we want to do the transition as quickly as possible. So it very much makes sense for countries and states and provinces to have incentives. But, those incentives just can't probably last forever because, governments need tax revenue and they're not about to give that up. But, the European Union overall has goals for emissions. They want to be down by 55% from the 2021 levels by 2030, and then net zero by 2035. So Switzerland thinks that they can meet those goals, even getting rid of this EV incentive, because, the demand is just starting to be there for electric vehicles.
4% duty they have, an import duty on, I don't know what it applies to other than vehicles. Perhaps it's other things as well. So that's 4% of the car gone, and on billions of dollars of revenue. For the Swiss, those neutral Swiss.
Those neutral bastards.
A special feature. This is a special feature that I have. Brian, I'm looking back as far back to 2011 as we need to go into the future to hit a zero decarbonized grid as our goal. Now, I added an extra year because the pandemic. So I'm going back a little bit further than I did going forward. I just wanted to review what things were like back then. So I did a bit of research.
So just to clarify, so we need to decarbonize our grid by 2035. That's just 11 or 12 years from now. So what you did is look back 11 or 12 years and just to see how far we come. Is that right?
That's right. And given that what we're doing in the next 12 years will be a magnitude larger many times over of what we did in the past 12 years. So expect
everything's accelerating.
It's not an equal comparison, but for inspiration, this is how far we've come. And by the way, by 2030, we need to be 80% decarbonized. And the places where we live in Canada, they're not doing that. There's lots of jurisdictions that are not aiming for that. But to meet climate goals, Paris climate goals, we need to be 80%. And it's freaking perfectly possible to do. What it's not possible to do, though, is to wait for new technologies like SMRs, which we'll talk about later, and other things that just aren't there. But we have what it takes now to get to that 80% if we had the willpower.
Yeah, and just the production capacity to make all of these solar panels and wind turbines and batteries, that stuff all has to ramp up rapidly as well.
Really fast, because next year is 2024, and then there's only 6 years left, if that. So wind power was at 47 gigawatts in the world. A gigawatt is about what a nuclear power plant puts out. So now there's 1,000 gigawatts of wind in the world, Brian.
From 47 to 1,000.
And that's without trying very hard. Now we're ramping up how much this goes back before the Paris Accord, okay? This goes back several years before then. In the world in 2011, solar was 100 gigawatts in the world. And that's in 2012, actually. I don't have the figure for 2011. So 100 gigawatts of solar in 2012. And now solar is getting 100 gigawatts per year installed. Wow. We're at the rate of 100 gigawatts per year. And that's how much what existed in the world in 2012. And it had a further run-up time than wind did, I think, if you look at it that way. By the end of next year, 4,500 gigawatts of solar will be in the world. That is 100 times what was there 12 years ago. 100 times.
James, this is blowing my mind, and I know this stuff pretty well because of our podcast.
Yes, well, that's why I thought it would be a good idea to review it, because we need to know how far we've come. A lot of cases, they say we only need to do 4, 5, 7 times what we have now, and what we have now in certain jurisdictions, sometimes it's like 3 times. We need 3 times. That's going to be a big deal. Well, come on. In the world, we have 100 times more than there was 12 years ago. So 12 years ago, lithium battery prices were $1,200 per kilowatt hour. That is $1,200 for 1,000 watts stored for an hour. Now they are $150 and falling fast. They now cost not half, not a quarter of the price, but 1/8 of what they did 12 years ago. And batteries,
wow.
That's largely due to electric car, adoption. But we are now making them for the grid and for building storage. And electric cars are at the S-curve, hitting the S-curve that they're taking off in many jurisdictions in the world. So that is going to fall even faster than it did. I mean, there is a point where you can't fall forever for lithium batteries, especially the pack price. But yeah, so in 2012, there were 130,000 electric vehicles sold that year. As many as 15 million will be sold in 2023. It's 115 Amazing. Times more. I did the math, wow. Brian.
Did you use a calculator?
I used an AI, a voice AI. So I pushing buttons is beyond my capability anymore at my age. Energy density has doubled for lithium-ion batteries, with tech showcasing another more than doubling is possible with the chemistries that are now being developed. So yeah. And that's important, because the more energy you can put into something, then you can start putting it in airplanes, and cars weigh less, and there's many benefits to, you can go further with the same power and less weight. So then you go even further. It's great.
This is amazing. So this is what we've done in the last 12 years without barely even trying. This is amazing.
Yeah, exactly. We were barely even trying. And by the way, in the next couple of weeks, I plan on doing complete net zero by 2050. So I'm going to look back that far in the past and see how far we've come there, just to do it again.
Nice. Okay. So we have a little bit of an update on the Cruise robotaxi story. So Cruise has been operating robotaxis in a few places in the US, but of course they suspended their operations after an accident. So there's some unflattering news has come out from The Intercept. They obtained information that suggests that Cruise autonomous vehicles may not exercise additional care around children. They're treated as a special category based on their unpredictable behaviors, which, it's such a complicated problem to develop autonomous cars. And if you think about it, yeah, children are ones absolutely likely to do something unexpected. So the computer brain has to treat them differently. But, information that has leaked out of Cruise has suggested that, they may not have been detecting children as accurately as they could. So Cruise, as we reported last week or the week before, has suspended all of their operations. They're now doing some layoffs. People involved in the actual cars and supporting the cars are getting laid off because, of course, the network's not operating. So it's a pretty big setback for them. They're still losing quite a lot of money. General Motors is the overall owner of Cruise. Yeah, who knows? It's obviously a problem that Cruise and everyone else is going to keep working on because the opportunity in the future is so enormous. Autonomous vehicles can kind of help everybody and could be a major cash cow. So there's going to be setbacks like this along the way, but no one expects this research to stop.
Yeah, there's also Waymo in the United States, which is a Google spinoff, and a company in China that's arguably doing a bit better than the American companies are. So yeah, it's a setback. And I also read that there's a lot of human intervention. There's no driver in the vehicle. If you're new to the show, there are robotaxis in California and San Francisco, Los Angeles, Phoenix area, and some other areas of the United States that are taking paid customers on rides without people in the vehicle. If you don't believe me, and I know I always read it to people who don't believe me, especially relatives. Look on YouTube and just watch somebody take a Waymo or any other kind of transportation and just watch the whole thing happen. I mean, it's scary. But, it's, I think, technically safer than, already technically safer statistically than per mile or per million miles or however you want to look at it.
Yeah, but the other thing we learned is that there's also human operators that are remote that can then take over the car if there's a problem. And it sounds like, statistically speaking, those interventions have been greater than people suspected they were. So, if you need a human intervention a certain amount of the time, then it's not really autonomous, and you're not really saving yourself the money necessarily of an actually autonomous vehicle.
That's right. And yeah, that's there every few miles, I guess, or every, it's ridiculous. It might be overstated because, they may not actually need to look at some of the things they did, that the system is just calling in and confirming advice or something like that. But yeah,
and they'd want to be safe and monitor, and
they do get lost. They do sort of, not crash, but, software crash and get confused and cause traffic jams. This is very frustrating for people. And they're also more cautious than human drivers. I long for the day when it will avoid wildlife on highways.
No, I've come close a couple of times, though. There's a lot of deer around here, especially dawn and dusk are the most, you really got to pay attention.
It's terrible in Wyoming. There's billions of them there. I swear to God, you can see them in herds.
Yeah. No, and I can't remember where it was, but sometime when I was driving in that area, either Wyoming or Colorado, they did have some road signs that said, if lights are flashing, animals have been detected near the roadway. So they in certain places, they have some detection mechanisms.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, I wish they would do more of that. And I wish they would do more of, like, a lot of roads had reflectors at the side of them. Like, sometimes reflectors can scare animals away. So there's a lot more that could be done. But, eventually autonomous vehicles will help a lot too.
All right, let's get to the Kardashian climate story. The climate story you didn't ask for and didn't think you would ever need. But here we are. Kim Kardashian, famous for being famous, introduced a new nipple bra. That is a bra that has built-in nipples. A bra that has built-in nipples has, a couple little bumps in them at the appropriate place to make it seem like you're cold. And she, equates this with climate change. And in her presentation video, she said the world is getting warmer. She wore studious glasses and gave a presentation about these fake nipples while wearing the bra in the video. The sea levels are rising, she said. The ice sheets are shrinking. Everyone can do their part. And by doing your part, she means wear one of these bras with nipples in them. Because it'll seem like you're cold no matter how hot climate change makes it. That, Brian Stockton, is the stupidest story we've ever had on the show.
Is this a new segment? The stupid story of the week?
I hope not to have any more of them, actually.
Okay,
I'm hoping this is it. I'm hoping there's no more, let's make a bra that seems like you're cold because of climate change stories. That's all. So we'll just move on with the show now, unless you have any further comment.
No comment.
Okay.
No comment. Okay, so we got a couple of good news grid stories. First one is from New Jersey, and these stories come from Electrek. Jersey Central Power and Light, they've got about 1 million customers in central and northern New Jersey. They're going to make their largest power grid upgrade in company history. We talk about this a lot on the show. There's absolutely no problem if everybody switched to electric vehicles, but we can't sit still. Every grid is going to need upgrades because we're going to be needing way more power in the future, but it's going to happen hopefully gradually enough that we don't have any issues. So this is a 5-year, almost $1 billion upgrade to the grid in New Jersey. They're going to upgrade 600 miles of overhead power lines with more robust wiring, so they'll be more resistant to storms. They're going to replace 46 miles of underground lines with, again, more heavily protected wiring.
Oh, I didn't know underground lines had to be replaced. I thought they were good forever.
Well, nothing lasts forever, James.
Maybe it's because they didn't start putting wires underground here until around the mid-'60s. Actually, my mother's house is the last house that has power lines. You cross the street, and they're gone.
Oh, yeah.
So, that house was built, I think, in 67 or 68. So,
yeah. Well, I had my son doing a bit of wiring in our house, which was built in 1962. We were doing some home theater upgrades.
Well, that's handy. Your son's an electrician.
He's an electrician.
What more do you need?
He's busy making money most of the time, unfortunately. But So I had him putting in an electric screen, and I had him cut into the wiring that we had in our rafters here in the basement and put in a new kind of electrical socket in the ceiling in the rafters. And so he had to cut through the 1962 wires to put this in, and it's a very weird wire. Like, it's got a green kind of almost like a cloth coating on it. And it's all
I've seen those. Yeah.
Yeah. And as soon as you cut into it, it's all kind of gooey and starts falling apart. So
it's got tape sticky stuff on it, and it's terrible.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that wires that you put in now are going to last better than those ones. But yeah. So anyway, this is going to cost almost $1 billion, but they do expect a return on that investment because they're going to get a more reliable grid from it. If power goes out, you can't charge for electricity. So they do expect that they're going to get all of this money back from increased reliability and then increased sales because they are, of course, expecting people to buy more power in the future. And somewhat related in Kentucky. So Kentucky has been a bit of a laggard in terms of clean energy, but they have just greenlit a 900% increase in their solar power in Kentucky.
Wow.
Now, it's easier to do a 900% increase when you're starting from a smaller number, and that's where they were starting from. They were, one of the laggards in solar power. So now they're going big, a 9-fold increase. And this has all been approved by the state regulators. And this is important because it's the first time that they're testing a new Kentucky law. So they passed a law in Kentucky that utilities have to get permission from regulators to retire the fossil fuel plants. So you can't just shut them down without asking permission, basically, from the government. But
it's like asking to quit smoking. You can't quit smoking unless you get permission from the government because, exactly. Our right-wing governments want freedom for everyone, so you have to ask the government first. And by the way, women's bodies, we own them.
The utility in Kentucky, they applied in May to retire 7 fossil fuel generated plants, and they're approved for 5 out of the 7, which isn't too bad. 2 coal plants and 3 gas-fired units are going to be shut down. They unfortunately also are going to build 2 new gas units. So this is, unfortunately, gas power is going to replace some of the coal, but of course, lots of solar as well. So yeah, this is the first time it's kind of testing this law about shutting down the fossil fuels. And it's not a total win, but Kentucky is at least heading in the right direction for all of this.
So I see it's currently ranked 43rd among U.S. states, which means there's actually states worse than it for solar. They're looking at you, North Dakota.
And once they're done this solar, they're going to bump up to number 17, which is pretty good.
Okay. Well, that's encouraging until they get a backlash from people saying, I don't like farmland having solar on it. And it's threatening to me because that is a thing now that is spreading from England to our country and the United States as well. Now, I want to get back to Tony Seba, the analyst from Rethink X, the futurist, the studier of technological and economic disruption. He had a presentation, it's I think a year or so old now, that he was talking about how Rethink did analysis for 3 different parts of the U.S., Texas, the Northeast, I think, and California, I believe. But anyway, they also ran the numbers for Alaska. So I thought this was interesting because what they are advocating doing is they know that solar, wind, and batteries are going to be the cheapest form. Well, solar is the cheapest form in the world, even with batteries in some cases now in certain jurisdictions, depending on where you are in the planet. Well, they're talking about Alaska. So I thought it was interesting because they, like I said, they advocate for overbuilding. And that is to say, this is the cheapest. So, don't build a nuclear plant. Don't build geothermal. Don't build hydro. Just use your existing hydro because it's there. And wind, water, solar, but also battery. So the notion that overbuilding is introduced here, that's new to me, Brian, is that you don't need seasonal storage in the north if you are overbuilding, because you're overbuilding for the worst time of year, much like the example I tried to convey last week.
You ran the numbers for your house and you know how much power your system makes, and it doesn't provide all of your needs. So you just have to run the numbers, find out, what is the time of year where you make the least amount of power, and then say you're only making 20% of your power at that time. Well, guess what? You just multiply that number of panels by 5, and suddenly it's 100%.
So it's north of the Arctic Circle, and they ran the numbers, and they do 2 cases. They do 100% solar, wind, and batteries, and then they do a 20% extra. If you invest 20% extra, this is what you'll get. You'll get more what they call free power or superpower, and that happens most of the year because you're building for the worst case scenario. In the Northern Hemisphere, that is Christmas time. It's in the winter. It's when the days are shortest and cloudiest and coolest, and you need the most energy to heat. Because if you go to 100% heat pumps or something like that, then you need your heating to come not from fossil fuels. So the solar PV capacity that they had in their algorithm here is 1.5 gigawatts for this Alaska area and 1.3 gigawatts of wind. And they have existing hydro, but it's only 0.05 gigawatts. But it's still important because it's a base load, and base loads are important for reducing the amount of other things. So the battery capacity that they would need to make this work, and this is hard numbers here, people. This isn't me spouting off non-expert stuff. 102 hours if you built up all that stuff, okay? And it would be $432 per person per year to do this, or a capital cost of almost $5 billion. So 102 hours of storage, that's 4.25 days, Brian, of storage. It's not seasonal. I mean, all the experts that are analyzing this stuff and trying to come up with solutions to get there, they're not talking about overbuilding at all. And maybe we should be. I mean, this is one school of thought. I'm not going to vouch for it, but it's one school of thought, and it's surprisingly cheap. It's only $2,200 per family of 4. And for that, you get not only your electricity, but your heating. And remember, it's Alaska, north of the Arctic Circle, and also your transportation energy, basically your gas bill for, driving around. All of that is taken care of for $2,200 for a family of 4. And it's only 102 hours of storage. It's mind-blowing because it doesn't get much worse than that. They said at worst, their scenarios that they've run in the world are only a few days, and some are as short as 2 or 3 days, and when it's sunnier and warmer. Current hydro was kept for this scenario, like I said, and it was interesting that it was equal wind and solar. It's not always the case. I guess the further north you get, the more wind you get in the mix, but a lot of times it's solar because solar is the cheaper. Just wanted to throw that out there, Brian. It still was a pretty low cost of electricity, and people, I mean, all the times they're saying this, they say, there's Alberta's running ads nationally about utility bills will quadruple and there'll be power outages. It's not true. You'll save money.
Not true.
You'll actually save money. Save money.
And the sooner you do it, the more money you will save.
And of course, the electricity system is more stable because there's batteries involved. And in other words, it's the opposite of what the naysayers are saying. And I don't know how to combat that other than to just keep talking on this show.
Yeah, and Alaska, obviously, like this is going to be one of the toughest places to do this because it's cold, it's far north, you got short days. And they're saying you only need 4.25 days of storage. Like 4.25 days is the most where you might have a situation where there's no sun, there's no wind. And then before you know it, there'll be a little bit of wind and you can charge up the batteries. There'll be a little bit of sun, you can charge up the batteries. 4.25 days of storage is nothing. That just seems crazy low.
Not when it's an existential threat. I mean, 4.25 days of an entire grid being stored. Yeah, that's a hell of a lot of batteries and a hell of a lot of money. Let's not, kid ourselves. But it's doable. I mean, it's not, we are not inventing, hydrogen in order to do seasonal storage. It's not necessary in this scenario where you overbuild. And I've been advocating for overbuilding before Tony Seba has. I think you might have gotten the idea from me on the show, in the early days of the show. Sure, overbuilding.
I'm shocked.
If something is so cheap that it's nearly free, then overbuild. And yes, it uses land, but, let's remind ourselves that precision fermentation in dairy is happening now. And 2024 is the year the major company that is making milk proteins artificially, which is identical because there's no genetic material in protein, and they're going to, the business to business is going to take out 1/3 of dairy. So how much land is that? That is, there's a lot of land used for grazing cattle, and just making food for those cattle isn't more land. So you took all that and you'd have, you'd only need a fraction of it, but I'll get more into that later.
So you heard it here first from James Nostradamus Whittingham.
That's correct.
Predicting the future before even Tony Seba. Okay, so moving on to a story that I feel like is a good news story. Tesla's now making deals with gas stations, basically, to sell them superchargers. So the first deal came up a week or two ago. We didn't talk about it, but now a second deal has come up where Tesla is going to sell their superchargers directly to gas station players, and they're not going to be branded as Tesla superchargers. They're going to be branded by these two different brands. So BP was British Petroleum. They were the first. That was a $100 million deal that they announced a week or two ago. And the latest deal is with EG Group, and they own a lot of gas stations and convenience stores. So this seems like a great idea that basically gas station owners are starting to wake up to the idea that, other forms of fuel other than gasoline could be part of our future. And it would absolutely make sense if you're a gas station to have both forms of fuel. Like, why wouldn't you? And then hopefully you can keep selling, chips and drinks and cigarettes as we transition to electric fuels.
Maybe not so much cigarettes. I mean, if you can help it.
Okay, cigars.
Sure.
So the EG Group, they've got 6,000 different sites across several markets. They're in Europe, they're in Asia, Australia, UK, and Ireland. BP, something similar. They're all over the world. Tesla is able to sell these chargers, it sounds like, cheaper than others. They've been making these things for over 10 years now, and the other players are kind of new. So this is I think, a really interesting development and basically good news that gas stations are starting to wake up to the idea that they're going to need electric chargers.
And it's interesting that they're choosing Tesla over all the other third parties because they may not necessarily be crazy about Tesla, but Tesla has the most reliable charging network. And that is, they'll look physically, the shadow of the charger will look the same. The profile will look the same, but it won't have Tesla branding on it. But yeah, they are reliable. And, what you need is a bathroom and maybe a little snack or a drink.
Yeah.
If you're on the highway.
And the chargers are going to include Tesla's kind of plug and walk away protocols. So they should be as easy to use as any of the Tesla chargers and should be available to all vehicles.
Well, that's good news as that expands. And, I question, speaking of the future, how viable gas stations will be if they're not, because, selling electricity isn't necessarily a high profit margin, and you can do it at a hotel, you can do it at a restaurant parking lot, a mall parking lot. So there's lots of competition for gas stations as we move to electricity. Brian, it's time for some nuclear news. This Week in Nuclear. So just an update on that Diablo Canyon in California. It's a 1.1 gigawatt reactor. It's been down for, I think, 44 days straight now. The other reactor, the Diablo Canyon 2, is also only working at 65% capacity. So that's a fraction of what those two reactors should be, and they're relying on, renewables to take over. And it's just, I know there's a lot of nuclear fans out there, and I'm going to hit you with one here because of this week. This is important. The only small modular nuclear reactor in North America to have a contract with the utility just ended that contract because not enough subscription happened to their power. Their expenses, as this typical nuclear, doubled or nearly doubled in the amount of years that they were working on it. So that was in Utah. The Utah Associated Municipal Power Systems and NuScale Power, this is the small modular nuclear reactor company that has been developing in this and has lots of funding from the U.S. Department of Energy, announced they have mutually agreed to terminate the carbon-free power project. And this is the headline in Bloomberg. Hopes of a U.S. nuclear renaissance sink with NuScale. The headline from Bloomberg is Hopes of a Nuclear Renaissance Sink with NuScale. The company, a bellwether for the move towards small modular reactors, has hit obstacles that is familiar: time and money. The renewables didn't do it any favors either, says Bloomberg. The project had not secured enough buyers of its planned output to continue. It isn't too hard to see why. In January, its estimated cost of power jumped by 53% to $89 per megawatt hour. The potential buyers of NuScale's project's output, 50 municipal power providers scattered across several Western states, ultimately couldn't stomach the risk. This is a quote from Bloomberg. While the end of the original wave of U.S. nuclear development is usually blamed on the 3 Mile Island disaster, the real problem was that the world changed, with the promising energy supply and demand dynamics of the 60s giving way to something less conducive to giant, expensive power plants that take a decade or more to build. Today, even SMRs face the same problem in the form of rising penetration of renewable power and batteries, which have mostly fallen in price. Their enthusiasm for NuScale stemmed from its desire to get off coal-fired power, part of an accelerating decarbonization of the grid in Western states. Between 2017 and 2021, a net 23 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity was added to the Western interconnection, whose grids cover 13 states and provinces in the U.S. and Canada. Even that is dwarfed by what is coming. This is Bloomberg that I'm reading from, and I think it's important, so I'm going to read lots. Renewables with effectively zero marginal running costs, in that they burn no fuel, squeeze down the number of hours in the day when traditional dispatchable power plants are needed. This is something I've been saying on the show. In some markets, solar power can already meet all demand in the middle of some sunny days. This creates a particular problem for nuclear power because its high costs demand that any plant be run as much as possible. The NuScale project's cost estimates assumed it would run 96% of the time. If you listen to this show and understand anything that I say, you know that that's not going to happen because renewables are variable and they're cheap and they ramp up certain times and certain days, and then nuclear goes down. Every time nuclear has to be turned down, it becomes more expensive because most of nuclear's cost is in the capital cost of building the plant, which is very expensive. There's a little bit for fuel, a little bit for security, a little bit for maintenance, but really a lot of the cost is the capital cost of building it. So if it doesn't run at 90%, which is what most nuclear does, so it's even kind of pushing it to say 96% of the time for these SMRs. So this wouldn't be needed in a grid dominated by renewables, especially those twinned with batteries, right?
Well, it's basically not, it sounds like it's not even possible. Like you'd have to take solar off the grid for these projects to be viable.
And why would you want to pay more? You'd have to pay more for that electricity. So it doesn't make any sense.
It's super expensive to build. And then on a sunny day, you just can't compete with, the solar power.
It's time for the lightning round.
The lightning round is a fast-paced look at the latest headlines in climate, clean energy, and transportation.
Is solar really taking up lots of prime farmland in Alberta, Canada? Ian Urquhart, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Alberta, looked into the question. He found most solar projects approved in Alberta between 2019 and 2023 are on farmland rated as severe or worse for crop production. That means they could be rocky soil, they could be on hills. The new generation would require 38,000 acres or 154 square kilometers. Well, that sounds like a lot. The researchers found it's only 5.6% of the land used in Canada for agriculture. And if some of that land goes away due to dairy disruption, well, you're going to be thankful to make some use of that land. And that's the way it is. Navis Research Canada, carbon tax on heating. Let's talk about that for a second. Removing the fuel charge from heating oil would add 0.1 million tons in 2030. Okay, this is the carbon tax debate that's taken over Canada, and why Brian was on the air talking about heat pumps the other day is because they want people who have heating oil, especially in the Northeast United States, where they are rapidly changing to heat pumps, and in Atlantic Canada, where there's heating oil, there's not natural gas infrastructure, so you can't just convert to natural gas without putting pipes in your cities and towns, and that's not going to happen. So you switch to heat pumps, and they have incentives for doing that. So you take the heating oil surcharge off, and it adds 0.1 million tons in 2030, removing the fuel surcharge from natural gas, which is what the provincial leaders are arguing for in Canada, including our dip crap. I can't not swear, so I'm not going to talk about them. Including our leader would add 4.5 million tons in 2030. So 0.1 for removing it from heating oil, 4.5 million tons in 2030 from all natural gas in Canada. So it's frustrating. The Alberta Energy Regulator reports the oil and gas industry is spending $1 billion per year to close unproductive well sites. Alberta is the place where we have oil in Canada mostly. It is estimated, that's the estimated cost to close all of its sites is now $100 billion. So where's that going to come from? If it's $1 billion per year in 100 years, is there going to be $1 billion from the oil and gas industry that doesn't exist? No. It's going to be taxpayers that are going to have to pay for that. And Polluter Pay Federation is on top of that, and they're talking about that. You can follow them on Twitter. From Reuters, Exxon aims to begin lithium production by 2026 in Arkansas. The Munich factory of BMW just produced its last fossil fuel car. It's been doing it for 60 years, Brian. 60 years of making fossil fuel cars, ICE cars, gas cars, diesel cars, is now only going to be EVs. So 60 years gone, and that is a changing world.
Wow. So yeah, the BMW Munich factory is going to be only EVs from now on. That's a big deal.
From Goldman Sachs, falling prices of critical minerals will lead to a 40% drop in the cost of batteries for electric vehicles by 2025. Let me repeat that. I don't know if you believe that. I don't know if I believe that, but this is Goldman Sachs. They're not, a bunch of kids. Falling prices of critical minerals, because we sort of, there's been sort of a supply problem. Too much demand, not enough supply, and prices have gone up. Well, they're going to fall, and they are falling, and they say 40% drop in the cost of batteries for electric vehicles by 2025, which is, 14 months from now. I don't know. You can't really say that. It's sometime in 2025. Let's call it the end of 2025. Let's call it 2 years from now. It's crazy. 40% drop in the cost. Maybe that's why all these electric vehicle makers are sort of delaying their plans a little bit and saying, well, we'll just wait a little bit longer.
Yeah, maybe. But certainly, mining needs to ramp up for certain minerals, but eventually there'll be enough supply and eventually that price will drop.
Battery pack prices, this is the pack price, the important pack price, not just the cells, are expected to drop an average of 11% a year from 2023 to 2030. That's encouraging news. This is from Bloomberg. The UK government is preparing to offer significantly higher subsidies for new offshore wind farms to get the country's clean power strategy back on track. That's important, Brian, because there's been a lot of talk about, I think there's only 3 major offshore wind companies in the world, and one of them just backed out of the United States contract, and they also just backed out of, I think, Norway or something like that as well. Yeah, it's important now to give wind a bit of a nudge. Germany agrees measures to ease electricity bills for manufacturers over the next 5 years in an attempt to boost the economy. So they're going to ease the electricity bills for manufacturers to give them a boost.
Yeah, Germany's been having grid power problems, so presumably the price has creeped up. So perhaps there needs to be a bit of a break.
Venture capital funding for climate tech startups has topped $7.6 billion just in the third quarter of 2023. $7.6 billion for climate tech startups, venture capital funding. That is quite high. And finally,
Amazing.
This week, from Asad Razuk's weekly Twitter thread on good climate news, because we have a lot of climate anxiety in the world, he does a thread on good climate news, and we are kind of a good climate news show as well. China is planning to cut vast amounts of methane because they are actually caring about the environment. China's CO2 emissions are set to fall in 2024 and enter a structural decline.
We're close to the peak, whereby it just goes down from there.
Forever. It's done. Because incredible acceleration of renewable deployment led by 210 gigawatts of solar in 2023. That's twice the total installed solar in the U.S. All the solar in the U.S. times 2, all done in China last year. And it's 4 times what China added in 2020. So they are going hard with what is cheap. And of course, they're manufacturing the panels for the most part. Certainly the ones that are installed in China are all from China. Amazon deforestation is at a 5-year low. That's nice to hear. The United States joins the consensus on loss and damage fund for poor countries. The COP conference is starting, Brian, and our questionable leader of our province is going, as well as our mayor. He wants to tell the story that the federal government won't tell of how clean we are. And of course, our grid is filthy, disgusting, dirty. You might as well smoke a cigarette as plug in a lamp in this town. It is disgusting. And he's going there to Dubai thinking that he's going to have a sympathetic audience because the Dubai, people are running it. The oil people are running the show. Namibia is starting the world's first zero carbon iron ore plant. Africa, Brian, is going to be the continent of great things in this century, and that's a good thing. It's a lot of good things, and
great.
they're gonna do that with renewables, not only making it for themselves, but for other countries as well, other areas, other continents even, via undersea cable. There are now 60 companies working on decarbonizing aviation. And China's fossil fuel use overall is going to peak in 2024. That's for all their fossil fuels, not just their emissions, but the use of it, so they know where things are going.
That is great. And that is our show for this week. So please take the time to contact us. We are at cleanenergyshow@gmail.com and around social media, Clean Energy Pod.
And once again, this week, I want to thank everyone for writing in. We appreciate your letters and are putting them to good use. Keep writing. We like to know everything you have to think, and any suggestions and articles that you want to send us, that is also great as well. And we have a YouTube channel for you to check out with some special features. We're on the TikTok. We run TikTok. No, we don't, but we're on TikTok. Have a look at the Clean Energy store for merchandise. The link, as everything else, is in your show notes. And you could donate to the show like Gene did this week. He committed to $2 a month to pay us on PayPal. Thank you, Gene. Brian, if everyone did that, my wife would respect me. Actually, if an eighth of our listeners did that, my wife would respect me. And
I might even respect you.
You might even respect me. Wow, imagine for that. If you're new to the show, remember to subscribe on your podcast app to get new episodes. Rate and review us if you can. That helps us. And why wouldn't you want to help us? We're here for you. Be here for us. Rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.